My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Roger Cunningham, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Absolutely. A pleasure to be here, Jerm.
I think what caught me actually was the title, Ethical Skeptic. What's the need for a skeptic to be ethical?
Well, in this context, and of course it's a nom de guerre, the ethical skeptic, it was what I used during the period of time where I was anonymous, because the people who oppose, many of the things that I sponsor or research, there are some things I research and I'm not buying into just yet. I want to understand it. That's what skepticism is. I use the nom de guerre to give me breathing room so I could do things and not impact my real life work with clients, with governments, with nations, doing strategies, working with government agencies or NGOs. I didn't want that work threatened by malicious actors. And in fact, in one business, I was managing partner of the business, and we got a letter about advocacy I had done in just a forum, the old forum style. I think it was a legacy of the BBS's, the old forums that used to run and rule the internet. We got a letter just because of a post that I wrote in a forum. Fortunately, I was managing partner, so I got the letter. And of course, it was from an anonymous person, so anonymity can be used. It's a double-edged sword. It can be used both ways. But I wanted to give myself breathing room to not impact client meetings. I've had client meetings where people brought up something I had in my personal communications on the screen before the meeting. I'm like, this is inappropriate, and it has no bearing on this meeting. So with those type of offenses, very commonplace in the market of social information, I wanted to insulate the two from each other, my work life, and of course this advocacy or this research. That's why I chose anonymity. Ethical in this context does not mean moral. It doesn't mean higher than thou. Ethical just means appealing to a long-standing, effective standard, a praxis, praxis, as it is called, that is shown effective across a large body of work. What we had happen in 1972 was really a wander away from true skepticism, and this pop skepticism came into place, with extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and Occam's razor is the simplest explanation. Both of those are misleading apothegms. They're not false per se. It's just that they're semantic truths. They are not logical truths, and they could be misused and abused to squelch subjects that have merit. So ethics pushes back against that. It's an appeal to bank robbers to stop robbing banks. It is not an appeal to it's not an appeal to, moral superiority or anything like that. In addition, the moniker, the ethical skeptic, is much akin to, and I relate it to industry or trade publications. One of the books I used during, coming up in navigation and training was called The American Practical Navigator by Nathaniel Bowditch. And he wasn't claiming in that title that he was practical. He was claiming he was a navigator, but the American Practical Navigator is a name for the discipline, and I'm using the ethical skeptic in that same regard, or the creative architect trade publication. These are not personal claims. They are claims to a standard that I'd like to encourage become part of the social discourse, or the substrate, the foundation for the social discourse.
I love what you said there about Occam's razor. I was just having that conversation about a week ago with somebody I know. It's not a very effective tool because it assumes that everything must be simple, and life is very complex.
Yeah, the abuse of Occam's razor starts with this. Occam's razor is not a decision heuristic. It is simply the gateway through which we introduce alternative options. We have what is called our most common belief is sometimes called, not always, but is called the null hypothesis. And that might be the prevailing belief. Occam's razor is the gate through which you say, Yeah, I understand the null hypothesis. I don't have a problem with it. But there's another idea at play here, and it needs to be researched. That compelling need to be researched is what Occam's razor is. Ockham, not the pop Michael Shermer version or Carl Sagan version of Occam's razor, where the simplest explanation tends to be the correct one. That's not the purpose or role of Occam's razor. Occam's razor says plurality should not be posited without necessity. And that is a qualification to say, if you're looking at anomalous craft flying in the sky, well, yes, certainly. We always consider the option that it's just misinterpretations, it's exotic military craft, it's electrical phenomena, it's drones now that we have that option available. Those certainly are always considered by most people. The issue becomes, when do we introduce that these craft are something anomalous beyond our current scope of understanding as a social entity, mankind? That we've passed that Occam's razor threshold. We have two alternatives. One is, but they're both really placeholders, but one is a placeholder. Something that is not us is flying in our skies. That's all you have to say. That alternative needs to be researched because it has surpassed the threshold of Occam's razor.
The pyramids are probably one of the most interesting talking points in the world. I've had the great pleasure of talking to Christopher Dunn and Ben van Kerkwijk and those in the sort of revisionist archaeological circles. If we just zoom out for a moment, what is your central thesis?
The central thesis that I have on the main two pyramids, that would be Khufu and Khafre, those are the names only. They're not actually who built or was buried or interred inside those pyramids, but they are convenient handles so that people know that Khufu is the Great Pyramid and Khafre, or Khafren, is the pyramid with the cap or the upper Tura limestone casing stones still remaining. My position is that they bear greater antiquity than the fourth dynasty of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, for a number of reasons, not the least of which none of the evidence that has been foisted by archaeology to date supports a fourth dynasty or Khufu origin. For instance, there have been two sets of carbon dating studies done on the Khufu pyramid and the Giza complex in general, the Bowman and Lerner studies, and they were done in the 80s and 90s. And why they haven't done any studies since, I think, tips us off as to the fear that exists in classical archaeology that they're about to be found out, and amateurs are running circles around them, doing an end run. Those studies indicated an antiquity of 3000 BC, which is a full 600 to 800 years prior to the Fourth Kingdom. So that's where it begins, right there. The only item that has actually been carbon dated, that has come from the Khufu pyramid, or any of the pyramids for that matter, is a thing called the Dixon cedar plank. It's actually a cedar-like plank. They haven't analyzed it for the actual, tree. When that item was carbon dated, it carbon dated to 2800 to 3600 BCE, so well before even the Old Kingdom of Egypt. And that was an implement being used by a tomb robber. Think of this. That plank was part of a grappling hook that was dropped down the Queen's Chamber north shaft. And they weren't able to pull the grappling hook back up, so they pulled really hard and ended up snapping, the rope that held that grappling hook. They were treasure hunters. You don't build a pyramid with a grappling hook, and certainly not down the shaft that you've already completed. In that deposition, that drop of material in that tomb raiding incident that precipitated the cedar-like plank, you have a broken stone, and it's not broken as in pressure, from above, from the stone stacked on top of it, knocked it out of position, and it went tumbling down the shaft. This was chiseled and forced out of its in situ location. In fact, you can see the floor chiselings underneath the stone so that it had room to move out. The idea that this stone just accidentally fell out of the wall of the Queen's Chamber North air shaft is ludicrous. It's to the point of panic. And when they present these arguments to engineers, and I'm a systems engineer and an industrial engineer as well, so I've done both analytical systems development, but as well construction of hundreds of very large structures.
And you've been
when
there.
you present those arguments, and I've been there, when they present these arguments to real engineers, it's laughable. It just discredits the field, and not only discredits the field, it raises beyond Occam's razor the notion, the contention that somebody behind archaeology is enormously terrified of these pyramids. They're enormously terrified of Göbekli Tepe. They refuse to do any carbon dating. They refuse to continue excavation. They send Zahi Hawass into every new chamber to make sure that it's okay before any cameras or public can come in. And we know Zahi Hawass makes sure that the place is scoured of any evidence that doesn't support a fourth dynasty Khufu origin for the Great Pyramid. All these things, this is just the beginnings of the malfeasance that exists in archaeology that has raised the specter of dishonesty, deceit, and more than that, control of the public discourse and public mind. That's the problem, and we decry that problem. It is an issue of ethics. It is an issue of skepticism, and that's why I take focus on the pyramid. But in addition to that was when I visited there with an Egyptian client, it was actually the Chamber of Commerce for Cairo wanted to improve what they would call their retail footprint. So I was doing a strategy for them, and they allowed me to go out and take one of their drivers and get a tour of the complex and go some places where the normal tourists don't get to go. And that was a lot of fun. But when I hit the Khafre pyramid, it was obvious that, there were no chips of the stones, the broken and removed stones laying about. And no matter how much you clean up that site, you're going to have some chips that remain. And that means shattered limestone. The calcium carbonate bonds would break, and they break in a certain fashion, like a knife edge to a degree. Just like cracking mica can make a beautiful knife, calcium carbonate will crack in certain patterns. None of those stones bore those patterns. There were none of the pieces of stone. The only stones laying about around the Khafre pyramid were made of granite, quartz-based granite. So those stones survived, yet the Tura limestone casing stones did not survive. And what I was able to ascertain through that visit, and it hit me while I was standing there, I'm like, these stones were dissolved by ocean water. How come nobody has ever seen this? You can see the upper erosion band on the top of the Khafre pyramid. You have the limestone cap that's, pyramidal and pyramidian in shape. Then you have a band right below it, and then you have this layering of detritus, this just garbage that lays homogeneously across the entire lower courses of the Khafre pyramid, and I call that detritus. It is actually the remnants of these dissolved stones. There's no chippings there. There's no shattered stones. It's all dissolved detritus. And at the base of the pyramid, you have what is called travertine, which is reconstituted limestone, which means the sludge that resulted from this dissolution, what is called carbonic acid dissolution of the Tura limestone casing stones. This sludge was heavier than water, fell to the bottom, formed like a paste at the bottom, and then when the oceans receded, it hardened again into a surface called travertine. During the 1800s, that travertine was everywhere. Scientists estimate that one face of one pyramid was about 75,000 metric tons. The travertine that existed at the base of all those faces, 4 for each of the pyramids, so all 8 faces for the 2 pyramids, was 55,000 tons. Would somebody bring that in and put it on top of the pyramid? Why would they put travertine? How could they put travertine on top of the lower courses of the pyramid? They can't. It had to have come from carbonic acid dissolution and oceanic submersion. 100%. And that if you look at that tidal band at the top of Khafre, it matches exactly the tidal banding from sea state 0 to sea state 8. And I'm a qualified 45 years qualified officer of the deck. I've been a blue water sailor for those 45 years, graduate of the Annapolis Sailing School, graduate of Georgia Institute of Technology's navigation courses over 2 years, graduate of the Navy's navigation certification programs, and been at sea and an officer of the deck for 45 years, or a skipper for 45 years. I know what tidal banding looks like. I know why it's there. I know this thing called karst erosion. And what we see is karst erosion on, 20 million or 3 million year old fixtures or, shoreline configurations. That's one thing. But when you have a fresh set of Tura limestone, which is not a durable, it's a cement more than it is a concretion, it's not very durable against ocean water because it sits below the ocean. It doesn't get exposed to the ocean when it comes out of the ocean bed. It's actually, covered by silt, a layer of silt, marine silt that shields that Tura limestone. The ocean builds that limestone. In fact, I think it was I think it was the Eocene in which the Tura limestone was deposited. That limestone, once it's exposed up in the air and then inundated by ocean, then that limestone is vulnerable to carbonic acid dissolution, and indeed that's what happened to the surface, the casing stones of the Khafre Pyramid. In contrast, the Mokattam limestone, which is more of a concretion, it's not a cement, it's a concretion. It's much, much harder. You can't really wrap it up inside of Mohs hardness, but if you had to roughly equate the backing or load-bearing stones in the pyramid, the ones that we see on the lower portion of the Khafre Pyramid, those are about a Mohs 5, maybe a Mohs 6 when you get to the hardest stones. But when you look at the Tura limestone casing stones, those are a Mohs 2 or 3. So that's why they dissolved, but the backing stones didn't. And so we were left with this wonderful, wonderful testament to an ancient oceanic inundation that covered the majority of the Khafre Pyramid and thankfully stabilized right near the top for some period of time. And it gave us the major clue as to what has occurred in our past. And that really lit off much of the ECDO theory research pathway, what I call the critical path. It's a term out of systems engineering. Critical path keeps you disciplined on the questions that you need to answer to prosecute a subject. And that's what launched me on the critical path.
Okay, so Roger, there are, from what I'm gathering, about 3 kind of underlying themes here. One of them is the timeline is wrong. Another is that there is suppression or a cover-up. And then the other is the water. Now, that's fascinating. I just want to quickly go to the first point that you were alluding to, and that's the cover-up. Why would this be suppressed? Why would mainstream archaeology not want this information in the mainstream?
Well, your average archaeologist is not trying to suppress information. They're just defending the narrative. And when you're a professional, your first instinct is going to be to defend the industry standards and the narratives that you operate by. And I battled that inside systems engineering and actually value chain strategy for decades, trying to get people off this idea that lowest cost equals best business. It doesn't. And I've run a very successful retailer and catalog, and I know this well. Lowest cost does not win you. Lowest cost basically is what you do when you've already conquered the industry and you're just extracting earnings to give to outsiders so they can trade those earnings. Then you go lowest cost, and that's the phase of crony capitalism that we reside in now in the United States. But the rationale behind all these innocent archaeologists who are just defending the narrative. An example was given. People sent me like 6 or 8 historical accounts that say that the pyramids were covered with gleaming white casing stones by Arab historians in the anywhere from 680 to about 1200 BC or AD, excuse me, or Common Era CE. And so when I go in and look at all 6 of those recitations, I find that not only did they not say that the pyramids were covered in smooth, gleaming white casing stones, not one word, I did a word search through all of them, not one time was that ever said. In fact, in over half of those recitations, the Islamic historians made it clear that when they ascended or they paid someone, Ibn al-Aziz in particular paid a local boy to ascend the pyramid. He said he ascended the pyramid in a matter of a few minutes, was able to go to the top and use his turban to measure the eroded platform, already flat platform because the pyramidion had been removed long ago, and it came back down in a matter of minutes. And he said he ascended and descended as if one would a series of stairs. Over half of the Islamic historian recitations cited that same condition, that the pyramids, the courses, as they're called now, each level, as they called them, were assembled as if a flight of stairs. And they said that about Khafren, and they said that about Khufu. So it's clear that even through 680 AD or CE, that the casing stones were missing. This is an example of where archaeologists don't actually test their own standing dogma because of the fear that they have that if they step outside the bounds of propriety inside their discipline, they will be punished. So that virtual power that they're reacting to is what I suspect exists. The same thing that they fear is the thing that I want to identify. I want to know why the archaeologists are terrified to step out of convention. And I want to know who's stimulating this discussion, what percent of archaeologists are complicit in it. And the answer is only a placeholder, Jerm, unfortunately. There is a power that has basically threatened archaeology. You will not disclose, you will not dig up any more of Göbekli Tepe. You will not investigate the syringes under the Khafren or the Khufu pyramid. No passages will be excavated. No carbon dating will be done on any of the organic material we found, except for the cedar plank. And when they got those results, they saw what a mistake they had made by doing that. You think about the red ochre inscriptions in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber in the Khufu pyramid. That red ochre has a vehicle and a binder, which is organic. All red ochre is assembled with a vehicle and a binder. And there's also a primer, adhesive, and of course the dye itself, which is iron oxide. But the vehicle and the binder are organic. All they have to do is go in and take a small flake sample off of one of those red ochre paintings inside the relieving chambers and carbon date it. But they won't do that because they know that it will date to 1867, the year that Howard Weiss entered all of those chambers and did so by himself for about 3 hours in each chamber, and then mysteriously invited in somebody behind him to then document the markings on the wall. So, long-winded answer to your question, Jerm. There is an agency, and I use this in that in the intelligence definition, and I do have a background in naval intelligence. When I was a naval officer, agency is that placeholder presence that motivates curious actions on the part of actors that you're monitoring. You have to project agency. It is a placeholder. It is a theory. It's a hypothesis many times. But these archaeologists are held in check by an agency which is terrified of Göbekli Tepe, terrified of Karahan Tepe, terrified of the Giza Plateau.
Why, though? What would it reveal?
Well, there's just the classic, it'll disempower ancient institutions, and of course a lot of money would shift its flavoring and its coloring to more I don't know what you would call it, ambitious or alternative or conspiracy-minded activity. They certainly don't want to lose that money, but I think the fear revolves around something more than money. It's existential, it's ontological. I apologize for using all these fancy philosophy words, but existential means that it is stark and of a nature that is broader and with more gravitas than mere money. And it is ontological in that it has to do with the nature of man's being, our origins, and our history that is being concealed from us. For instance, when you look at Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, we hear about it was hunter-gatherers building a temple, it was symbolic and a skull cult, and it was assembled in 9600 BCE. But when you map out the actual asterisms on Pillar 43 and lay them out in Stellarium or in Starry Night Pro 8, that's my preferred astronomy package, it's clear. I mean, it's unequivocal. Just giving every chance to the null hypothesis. It's 1 in 10,000 chance that it doesn't match a star asterism pattern from 14,800 BCE. Why wouldn't anybody do that? It's very easy to do. Why did no one in archaeology step forward and publish a study? That would have made their career. If they had published a study saying, hey, I've broken Pillar 43, I know what the asterisms mean. It doesn't date to 9600 BCE. It dates to 5,200 years prior to that. And then ask the question, why? Number one, why do we have the reuse of an item that was clearly carved for a date in 14,800 BCE? And then two, why do we insist on concealing that? And why did we take that once we found out that this set of asterisms, this pillar, was communicating a cataclysm from 14,800 BCE by the precession of the equinoxes? That's how I dated the pillar. We decided, we ought not dig up any more pillars because Pillar 43 should not even have been in the social discourse. You know, it's one thing if you've got a hog or you've got a snake carved onto a stone that doesn't really mean anything, you know, and it's out of its context. It actually does have meaning, but you have to have context before you approach it. But that pillar was one of the foundational Rosetta Stone pillars, Pillar 43, and its interpretation breaks the archaeological narrative, falsifies it. And again, they are terrified of that answer. And I think that's the reason why they planted the olive trees across. And then it was no coincidence. The olive trees just happened to be on top of the most sensitive acreage of the site. The sites, the locations where the most valuable troves of topology would be held. They put trees on top of that with impunity, exactly where those positions were. They weren't random placements. Fortunately, we pulled the trees or cut the trees, but unfortunately, when you cut a tree down, its roots continue to grow unless you extract the stump, and unfortunately, there are hundreds and maybe a couple thousand of these trees, so they couldn't pull up all the stumps. Those roots will continue to grow and reach down and destroy as many artifacts as this agency wanted destroyed. So these irresponsible actions, these hint at agency that is terrifying the members of archaeology. Ethical skepticism says you need to stand up, put on big boy pants, use big boy rules, as the Navy SEALs call it, and start doing your job. No more of this agency fear.
So if the timeline is wrong, that would also throw into question pretty much everything that we think we understand. I mean, the mainstream narrative is that life started simplistically and has over time become more advanced. What this kind of argument suggests is that history could be cyclical.
Yes, and what ECDO theory proposes as a hypothesis is that cyclical history is driven by a cyclical planet. And the O in ECDO means oscillation. D means Zhenebekov, which means, if you've seen the video and the space station video, the Russian astronaut Zhenebekov determined that if he spun a wingnut off of its threaded bolt, that it would spin, and it spun as expected, but then it did something unexpected. It flipped 180 degrees on its axis, and it took years for scientists to realize that this was a zero energy natural state of a rotating body, a three moment rotating body in space. Unfortunately, our Earth is not a bowling ball. It's not homogeneous. It is anisotropic. And that simply means that it's not evenly massed in every direction going out from the center of the Earth. As you head toward the Pacific, as you head toward the Pacific Rim, and as you head toward South America, there are heavier moments there that exceed the moments under Africa and in the middle of the Pacific. And that imbalance, that anisotropic nature of the Earth, causes a Janabekov-like flip, but that's not really the only thing that occurs. Periodically, I believe the sun will introduce what is called a geomagnetic excursion to our magnetic North Pole. Our magnetic North Pole was in Canada when I grew up, when I was going through navigation. Nathaniel Bowditch cited 11.7 degrees as the variation between magnetic north and true north. True north is the actual rotational axis of the Earth, or the direction that axis points in the sky and hits Polaris, the North Star. The magnetic north was somewhat west of that or left of that, 11.7 degrees. We had to use that in all our site reduction calculations in navigation on ship and, of course, in school. And so I had that memorized or ran into it. Well, that changed starting in 1973, commensurate with the planet heating up, or the oceans heating up, technically, and then the air heats up after that, the atmosphere heats up after that. At the same time that our planet began its hyper 1.5 degrees Celsius excursion in temperature, as climate scientists have pointed out, at that same time, our magnetic field began a precipitous weakening in its strength. And then the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole, took off out of Canada across the Arctic and is now headed into Russia. But curiously, we mentioned the cyclic nature of the Earth. It's heading on the same path that it has done periodically over the last, measurable set of excursions. Principally, one is the Lachamp excursion, which occurred 42,000 years ago. Lachamp 2, I believe that was. It's migrating along the same pathway there. What ECDO proposes is that periodically the Earth goes into these resets. That one of the resets was the flood of Noah. We put flood in quotation marks there because it's not actually a flood. Technically, it's an inundation cataclysm. The inundation of Atrahasis, the inundation of Zuasidra, the inundation of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the inundation of Gongon out of China. 175 myths cite this cyclical nature of mankind and the cyclical nature of the planet, more than 175 myths. So what you raised there, Jerm, is an absolutely valid and concerning principle that mankind, and indeed life on this planet, have learned to evolve around the cyclical nature of this planet. ECDO just fabricates, ECDO just performs or submits the first true scientific hypothesis of this nature.
Come on, Roger. The narrative is that a whole bunch of slaves with chisels and hammers built the pyramids.
Yeah, one of the things that you learn in systems engineering and industrial engineering, both engineering sets, is a thing called work content measurement. And you cut your teeth on that when you first get into an advisory firm or you get into an operations firm. And what you do is you measure the work that's entailed on any given task. And you look at the task sequence of activities and determine, hey, is this being done right? How much work content, how many minutes of standardized work? And you do this through a thing called a rate derivation form. I did thousands and thousands of rate derivation forms in the construction industry. So if you took one brick and stacked it on top of another on the mortar that you just laid, I identified the work content that was involved in that in my younger, wet behind the ears, green years, and did thousands and thousands of those rate derivation forms. So I know how to do work content measurement. I know how to do it from observing a process, and I know how to do it by watching the end state of construction. I've been the design engineer, not a mechanical engineer necessarily. They do a lot of the shop drawings and the detailed engineering. But I've been the design engineer, which means I arrive a year before the building is built, and I leave a year after the building has been accepted and is doing what it's supposed to be doing. I'm there the whole time watching every single step of the engineering. I've built over 150 100,000 square feet or larger buildings during my career, and I know how the work content imparts cost into those structures, because the costs that I estimate have to perform. If I tell a client that the building is going to cost $40 million and it ends up costing $43 million, I'm going to get fired. So I have to, under accountability, identify the work content that is involved in the assembly of a large structure. Largest one I ever engineered was 4.4 million square feet, and the complexity of that project was far greater than the complexity of the Khufu engineering project. Now, difficulty, Khufu was what's more difficult. However, when I looked at those stones, when I went out on site working for the Egyptian client, I was able to identify the elements that impart an understanding of work content, and developed actually rate derivation forms for the stacking of these stones, the moving of the stones, from the cutting of the stones, the finishing of the stones, the apportionment of the stones to the river traffic that was bringing it down to the pyramid, the handling, the staging, the sorting, the stacking, all those things that go on in real life, the pre-staging, the lift of the stones, the placement, the rolling, the final finishing, the superintendent's time. And if you extrapolate all that out to the broader community in Egypt, you have to police the people, the workers. You have to feed them. You've got to take waste away and garbage away. You've got to defend them with a military force. You've got to have support structures all behind these workers. So just assembling the work content and determining how many workers are required to build this building is not, that's just the first step. You have layer upon layer. And what I determined is that probably it took a population of about 1.8 million people to build that pyramid in the time frame that was identified by Herodotus in his book, the third book in Histories, which was written in 440 BCE. The third book is called An Account of Egypt, and he said that the pyramid was built in 20 years. Based on the rate derivation forms I ran, there's absolutely no way. However, if we're given unlimited resources and no interruption of work, 1.8 million people would have been required to be directly supporting or working on that pyramid. It would have left the country defenseless. It would have been such a foolish maneuver on the part of Pharaoh Khufu that he would have endangered his entire family's dynasty. He would have been irresponsible to the ancestors. An outside force could have come in and conquered them. If he lost the political will, when these 1.8 million people got frustrated that the ramp, they built it with a ramp, every time the ramp breaks, the construction has to stop. People who propose ramps have never built anything in their life. If you roll 2.5 million, 2 to 2.5 to 80 ton stones across a ramp, that ramp is going to deteriorate. And when that ramp deteriorates or structurally fails, you shut down the project until you can rebuild that ramp. So this fairy tale that archaeology has foisted, it stems a little bit from Herodotus's accounting, has served to obfuscate the true amount of work content in these stones. So it's obvious. I think the stones were assembled by humans. The question is, what humans, when, and how much of this humanity was required to build these edifices? It was something extraordinarily outside the context of either the technology or the social capability of Old Kingdom Egypt. And that's absolutely clear if you're an engineer that has the background I've got.
Yeah, there's no possible way they could have been primitive people.
Yeah. When I went into the Queen's Chamber, the first thing that I saw, the first thing that hit me, I'm like, how come nobody has seen this? Is that the limestone has been quicklime deteriorated around the East Passage niche in the Queen's Chamber. In fact, it's just as you come out of that niche, it's like a fireplace on the east side of the Queen's Chamber. And as you come out of the fireplace, the limestone has turned into quicklime just above that opening, which requires greater than 1,300 degrees Celsius temperatures. How do you get that? And then as you look above that, there's a presence there of vitrification that I call leoparding. It's where the impurities in the limestone, they turn to glass and they turn brown. And so it looks like leopard spots. That happens at about 900 to 1,100 degrees Celsius. So it patterns up just as if heat was coming out of that passage. You have the quicklime giving way to a broad pattern all across the ceiling and ranging across to the other side of the Queen's Chamber of leoparding. So there's no doubt high heat was in the Queen's chamber of the pyramid. The question is, if there are no combustion residues, and you didn't have the room inside that niche to assemble that large of a fire, a combustion source in the first place. So we know there was no fire there. The only alternatives that are left are electrical energy or nuclear energy. I don't think we have the isotopic alterations of the limestone that would indicate that powerful nuclear radiological source, actually. There's no doubt that by deduction, that passage handled what is called low voltage, high amperage. We use the inverse of that today. We use higher voltage, lower amperage for safety reasons. But this was actually exposed to low voltage, high amperage, high resistance electrical power. So Christopher Dunn's theory, I think it's absolute validity. However, the energy was used right there in the room, because if you have high resistance that produces heat, that means you're using the energy. Otherwise, you've messed up. And if they knew how to generate that much electrical power, they knew about resistance and when not to have resistance and when to have resistance. That room had a high degree of resistance in it, whatever was in that room, and it caused those heat signatures. So the question is, what device existed in that room and what was it being used for?
Well, Max Zamilov also argues that some form of electrical power or nuclear power could have been used there.
I spent a good bit of time with nuclear training in the Navy and 2 years in the nuclear engineering school at Georgia Institute of Technology. So the alterations that happen to the casing of a nuclear reactor, you can detect the isotopic alterations that occur when you've exposed a concreted or cemented stone like limestone to alpha radiation, beta radiation, gamma radiation, fast neutrons, and thermal neutrons, the 5 components that result from a nuclear reaction. All of those, with the exception of probably alpha particles, well, even the alpha particles would exist in situ. They would exist in the matrix of the nearest limestone. All of them would exhibit specific patterns that we would look for. Number one, why hasn't science looked for those? Again, this defaulting to the narrative as an excuse. But number two, I don't think that those features exist. Just like if you burn a fire inside the pyramid, the carbon residues are going to be on the stone and in what is called the interstitial matrix of the stone for tens of thousands of years. So you're not going to be able to hide it unless you just remove the stones entirely. So I think that we're left with this heat signature issue, and the only energy source that is within the normal context of humanity or achievable by quasi-humanity, earlier versions of humanity, it remains electrical energy. I think the quicklime melting there just matches the feed of a high amperage, low voltage current very, very well, but not nuclear and not combustion.
I mean, I think if anybody just looks at the design of these pyramids, if you just look at like a dissection of it, it makes no sense to the layman that this was a tomb. The whole tomb narrative probably came much later on in history. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. It was clear that they were trying to enforce it when Howard Weiss entered the relieving chambers in 1867. So they already had their plan in place, and they put pressure. Howard Weiss was not an archaeologist. He was actually a military intelligence specialist who had a fascination with Egyptology. Well, from being in intelligence, one of the chief tactics of those agencies, smaller agencies with a small a, those agencies love smart, obedient but dumb individuals, and that's what they thrive on. They want you to be tactically smart so that inside your compartment, as it is called in black intelligence, and I held 4 compartments when I was in black intelligence. When you're inside that compartment, you need to do your job well. Number one, you need to be obedient to what the assignment is. Number 2, and then number 3, you need to be dumb about everything else and the broader picture. And that's what makes a good intelligence analyst. And that's exactly what Howard Weiss was. He was obedient and he was dumb. In fact, he made some mistakes when he forged those ochre painting marks in the relieving chambers, some fatal mistakes. And that's principally why they don't want to look at those anymore. They just want to say, oh, the name of Khufu, Mejidu, Kunum Kuf was in the pyramid. 1,400 years of names for one guy are all painted in a pyramid that was built in 20 years. Were the stone quarrymen all Egyptologists? How did they know all three names? But an academician from the 1860s would know the three names, or at least two of the three names. So I think the buffoonery that existed there, I think that Weiss was probably not as smart as they needed. For instance, he painted the red ochre over the 10,000-year-old patina on the surface, the finished surface of the limestone blocks. Those limestone blocks were laid in situ, fully surface finished and clean. There are two types of patina that now exist on those blocks. There's a goethite patina, which is orange, and then an anaerobic patina, which is black. Both of those are on the stone upon which the Kunum Kuf cartouche is painted, and that red ochre is painted over that patina without exception. So there's no possible way, it's quad erat demonstrandum, there's no possible way that those red ochre marks were from antiquity or the fourth dynasty of Egypt. It falsifies the narrative. The narrative is a zombie theory. It's still walking around, but it's dead as a doornail. And Egyptology, to their discredit, will not admit this. Most of them won't even see it.
I think one of the most interesting talking points around the pyramids is the flood, the water. I've heard this before a few times, and I find it incredibly fascinating. Take me through that.
Well, a flood technically is when you have water that rises because of, let's say, a creek bed gets an excessive amount of rain, and its propagation downstream causes lake levels and reservoir levels and eddy pocket levels to rise and threaten, the 100-year floodplain around it. When we built buildings, we had to be outside the 50-year floodplain. Fortunately, we do have fairly good tracking, not in every case, of the history of floods inside our surveying database for the United States, and we place our buildings around the green space and the 50 and 100-year floodplains that exist from that data. But a flood typically is when the rivers rise or back up. That's not what happened in the case of Noah in particular. Let's use Noah. Let's equate Noah to Utnapishtim or Zisidra or Atrahasis. What they cited was a cataclysm and an inundation. The Bible cited a flood because that made more sense to its target audience at the time. They wanted people to understand what they wanted them to understand but not comprehend. When you understand something, you say, I'm familiar with that. I know what a flood is. Now I understand the waters rose and killed everybody. Well, that's understanding, but it's not comprehension. Comprehension is, wait a minute, that can't be a flood. I mean, look at the source documents. The water came from the ocean rapidly, surmounted the citadel of Susa first, and then came crashing over into the valley. That's not a flood. That's a cascading inundation from the ocean. The only way that can happen, it can't happen from the polar ice caps melting. The only way that can happen is through an aberrant georotation, what is called a Euler rotation. There's a hidden axis that the Earth will rotate around that precipitates this Janibekov rotation, and it does so once every so often inside mankind and Earth's history.
So, sorry, can I jump in? I beg your pardon, but is that what the Younger Dryas was?
Well, the Younger Dryas is a very complicated period. It centers around what is called the black mat. And inside the black mat, we have a high iridium, 151, I believe it is. I can't remember the isotope number. But we have a high iridium content in that black mat, which suggests an impact. And I think there are good, credible theories or hypotheses around the impact theory of the Younger Dryas. However, the Younger Dryas was a good 1,400 to 1,700 years long. And inside of it, or bookending, bracketing either side of the Younger Dryas was these events called meltwater pulse 1A and meltwater pulse 1B. And these events, they say, well, the water melted rapidly at the poles, and this water cascaded across the planet and drowned a lot of animals and submerged a lot of geostrata. And I'm like, there's no way that the melting of the poles could cause the damage that's observable in the Gobi Desert or the American Southwest or the Saudi Desert, the Sahara. There's no way a melting polar ice cap could cause that much inundation potential and then recede back that quickly. So they call it a meltwater pulse because they don't want to say a Euler rotation inundation, technically, which is what ECDO theory proposes.
So if I'm following correctly, it's like a wobble or a very immediate kind of shake that would then cause that flooding.
Yeah, the Earth keeps rotating as it normally does in terms of our equatorial rotation. However, it presents a new surface to the North Star. So it's a zero energy rotation. If you think about it, there are two different types of tilt, if you will, that people colloquially speak about in our social discourse. One is called an obliquity tilt. Venus and Uranus are both obliquity tilted. In order to do that, you've got to have an enormous amount of external energy. That's not what ECDO theory presupposes. ECDO theory cites what's called an inertial interchange true polar wander. And what that is just simply the outside body is somewhat similar to Hapgood's construct. I wouldn't call Charles Hapgood's notion a theory because it didn't have the elements of hypothesis in it. But it's a cool idea. It's an excellent construct. And that's where you start when you develop hypotheses. You start with a construct. He said that the outside body of the Earth, like the skin of an orange, rotates independently and presents a new surface to the North Star. His citing was that caused the inundations. So that was the first thinking, really, that centered around this type of idea. What ECDO theory postulates is that this decoupling, instead of happening at the crust, where there really isn't a mechanism to decouple, and that really has been one of the things that's kept the theory squelched, is there's no viable mechanism there. The viable mechanism does exist at the core mantle boundary. In fact, it suggests that this is an absolutely stark potential if you look at the core mantle boundary. That's what ECDO proposes, that particular situation in the core mantle boundary causes this outer rotational body to do an inertial interchange true polar wander. A portion of that wander was smooth and gentle within reason. I'm sure the oceans were a little more energetic, but a portion of it during the capture by an inverted geomagnetic pole, in other words, the magnetic pole's North Pole was down in Antarctica, when it was captured by that, when our outer magnetite structure of the crust was captured by that pole, it was pulled into location very rapidly, and that's what precipitated these oceans to come up out of their banks. It did exactly what the Gungan historians said. They said that the sky rolled from the southeast to the northwest, and that's exactly what the ECDO rotation presupposes. And we developed the rotation based on the geomechanics first. We didn't look at the myths. And then we went out and took that georotation and said, okay, let's compare this rotation to the myths that are out there that are informative, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, like the Gungan theory, or the Gungan tradition. And in fact, they matched in the geostrata, the location of the saline diatomaceous deserts that have aridified across the planet. They all match this ECDO rotation. And that's what the 6 or 8 modeling groups that are working on ECDO now, they're finding unequivocally a good match to the Earth's deserts, to this inundation and rotation.
So that would have been quite a quick event.
A portion of it. The capture, right now, as we understand the differential inertial moments in the Earth, they're not large enough to cause a 12-hour or 18-hour rotation of the Earth into this new position. However, if we introduce an inverted geomagnetic pole, the geomagnetic pole captures the Earth's shell and brings it into alignment with wherever it is. Once the North Magnetic Pole makes its journey across Asia, the central body of Asia, and then through the Bay of Bengal and down into Antarctica below Africa, it reinvigorates it re-strengthens its permeability or its polarity and captures the Earth's body, except now the Earth, instead of pointing toward our north that we recognize today, it has to point the other direction. And if it's already undergone this decoupling, this Janibekov rotation, it is now somewhere wandering slowly in, the North Pole would be in southern Africa. Once the geomagnetic pole captures that Earth body, it'll snap it into its final position. And ECDO postulates that snap, that final phase, is what indeed precipitated this high energy displacement of the oceans.
And thus, the pyramids ended up underwater.
Correct. When we're in state 2, most of the modelers right now, they're modeling the viscosity of the mantle, they're modeling the ablate redistribution of the oceans, they're modeling the progression function for each of those. In other words, none of that happens. Most of that doesn't happen immediately. The oceans do. They model the speed and arrival of that turn, that Janibekov turn. Most of them are finding that the height of the ocean about in state 2, our alternative rotation, equates just about that 597 foot above sea level elevation that put the tidal banding mark on the Khafren pyramid. So it's a very pleasing set of outcomes in the models so far. We got a long way to go on them, but the modelers are just doing absolute gangbuster work.
Yeah, so basically just the tips of the pyramids were sticking out.
Yeah, both of them had their tips sticking out. I don't think that their construction at that level was an accident. I think the ancients wanted to tell us, we know exactly how high the water's going to go. This has happened so often and has been so consistent. We know how high the water is going to be. So we're going to build a device or set of devices that both tell you what we were looking at, and the 3 chambers inside Khufu tell you exactly what they were looking at. And we're going to give you these warning indicators that show the height of the flood so that ancients know, and this agency that keeps us ignorant, there's no way they can unstack these 5 million stones in their effort to get rid of this. In fact, I don't think they really understood. Most of their minions did not understand what had occurred, what these marks on top of the Khafren pyramid indicate. And fortunately so, or they would have cleaned up all of that. They would have removed those stones in short order had they known that this was indicative of a state 2 under ECDO theory tidal band.
I suppose the Sphinx is a whole conversation on its own, but was it underwater too?
Yes, and you can see it. There are 2 types of erosion. Dr. Robert Schock proposes what is called a verticalized channel erosion, and that comes from rain and wind. And indeed, you have that. You've got about 10,000 years of verticalized channel erosion on the walls of the enclosure, the Sphinx enclosure, and then on the Sphinx itself. But underneath that verticalized channel erosion is another type of erosion called karst erosion. Karst erosion comes from inundation with seawater. It cannot come from rain, cannot come from wind, cannot come from sand. We don't have enough time for that erosion to occur, even if it did, but it's planarized, it's laminar, it's planed, it conforms with the plane or the plane of the deposition of that limestone. If you look at it, the Sphinx is alternating between Mos 5, Mos 3, Mos 5, Mos 3, Mos 5, Mos 3, Mos 5 limestone. And when it was inundated by ocean water, the Mos 3 segments eroded more than the Mos 5 segments, and that was what caused that scooping that exists underneath the verticalized, channelized rainwater erosion. So that pointed to a specific period of time. It doesn't point to a specific number of intervening years, but it points to a specific time and says, hey, this entire area was covered in ocean water, not backup of the Nile, because the Nile would not do this. Only ocean water carries enough carbon dioxide in form of carbonic acid to achieve this karst erosion on both the Sphinx and the Khafre pyramid. So both of them, indeed, were under ocean water. Yes. And then the channelized, verticalized Dr. Robert Schoch observation or John Anthony West observation clearly shows the antiquity of the Sphinx as well.
Now, how long would they have been underwater, and were they very watertight?
Let's answer the second question first. They were indeed very watertight. If you stack up that many stones and they are face finished to provide an airtight enclosure, and that was their goal, and you stack so many layers of that type, you do achieve airtightness. There's no doubt about that. But to your first question, there are several indices that allow us to make an estimate of how long the pyramids were under this oceanic condition, this state 2 condition, as ECDO theory calls it. The first is the marine silt deposition that is inside the subterranean passage south passage, or subterranean chamber south passage, excuse me. There's a 3 to 4 inch marine silt deposition that exists all through that passage. And it's not a passage that people could crawl into easily, but the deposition is very homogeneous, very gentle, and laid down over time. That's marine silt deposition. In coastal regions, it takes about 75 years for marine silt to deposit to that 3-inch level. However, in a non-communicating, in the Navy lingo here, in the oceanography lingo, in a non-communicating chamber, say like in a cave, the deposition rate is 1/3, 1/4. So if we multiply that out, we get roughly 300 years of submersion to achieve that marine sediment deposition. But as well, if you take the cement of Tura limestone and subjugate it to a good dousing inside or inundation under carbonic acid ocean water, it would take probably 400 years for those stones to dissolve under both the kinetic action of the waves as well as the chemical action of the carbonic acid equation. So about 400 years, long-winded answer on that. Finally, when you look at it, the travertine that has been dated by a recent study has been shown to be about, I'm trying to think of it, I think it was 6,000 years antiquity for the travertine. So it basically formed as a result of our rotation from ECDO state 2 back to state 1. In other words, all that mass of goop at the base of the pyramid, once the ocean was gone, it rehardened into its own concrete down at the base of the pyramid. And you can see it in all the photos from the 1920s of the pyramids. It exists at every pyramidal base, every faced base. It was all, quote, cleaned up for tourism. If archaeologists had been worth their salt, and that's a segue to the next point, they would have taken robust samples of that travertine and asked the question, the critical path question, from whence could it possibly have arrived? You can't just cart that in and drop it and have it form travertine. It doesn't work that way. And it was on top of the workmanship, so it had to be brought in. Did man bring it in, or did an ocean bring it in? And the ocean is the only possible, we use that term again, quod erat demonstrandum. The ocean is the only possible means by which that travertine got there. So when you look at those clues, they absolutely deductively isolate the case of about an origin of about 9,600 BCE as the date of construction for those pyramids. But there's one other tantalizing clue which everyone's missed. And it's at the end of the Queen's Chamber South air shaft. I call it the penultimate stone. And it's right before the closing door that has the two brackets, which are actually copper cables. They're inside the door. When you look at that ceiling stone right before that final door, there's a star chart engraved in it. And being a navigator, of course, I'm fascinated with star charts. I know what they mean. So when I take that star chart and I orient it toward the northern sky, and it is indeed depicting the northern sky, it's the northern sky in a certain period of time, and I apply the precession of the equinoxes to it, I get a date on that stone unequivocally of 9,200 BCE. And that's carved into that stone. And fortunately, archaeology can't get up there to erase that now. It's been photographed already. And again, they didn't know what they were photographing and released it to the public before they had a chance for a Zahiawas type actor to get in there and go, no, erase that. We need samples of the limestone, and we want to take the samples right there and erase this. They didn't do that. So now we have the star chart carving, and it gives a clear date of 9,200 BCE for the assembly of that air shaft.
Roger, I want more. Will you come back onto my show?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This is a very pleasant venue, and you had some of the best questions I've been given. Yeah,
okay, so
absolutely.
All right. Well, that's good news. So for now, how can I follow your work?
You can, I always promote, you can obtain the book. It's called Inversion, ECDO Theory. It's 405 recitations, academic recitations, 140 analytical figures. So it is dense, even compared to Stephen Wolfram's work or Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species or Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Those are the books that I admire and I use as my benchmarks. This has more depth and recitation than any of those. So I've spent 25 years researching the basis of this book. But you can also go to the Ethical Skeptic website. It's www.theethicalskeptic.com, and there you can find all the material for free. You don't actually have to buy my book. All the images and analyses are in 5 different articles that are on the site. And then finally, my handle is Ethical Skeptic on X. Those are the 3 venues that I participate in.
I noticed you said X. I still struggle saying X. I prefer Twitter.
Yeah, I still like Twitter as well, but it took me a while to get the vernacular, get into the habit of the vernacular there. But now I've got it, I think. But yeah, I keep a daily presence on X. Yeah.
Roger Cunningham, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Jerm, it's been a pleasure. Loved it.